Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back again to another edition of the Aftermarket Champions Podcast. Today, I'm excited and delighted to be joined by Carla Wynter, who's a VP of Global Parts and Services with Johnson Controls, which is a $20 billion global buildings solutions company, and is headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Carla, I think, joins me from Milwaukee today. So, welcome to the podcast, Carla. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. Excited.
Well, this has been an interesting journey for us in terms of the podcast, bringing leaders like you on here. And what we find out is that the listeners of the podcast are professionals like you and us who are trying to understand and learn from each other what's going on in the world around them. And more importantly, how people like you have made the transition to these roles, the kinds of experiences they've had. And these are kind of very good learning experiences for people. So I really get excited when I get somebody like your caliber and seniority to join the show today. So thank you for that. So, Carla, the conversation is going to be very casual and focused on your career, if you may. So, maybe if you don't mind giving us a bit of an introduction to yourself and your journey, maybe to getting to this new role that you just took on a few months ago.
Great, thanks. So, we kind of went over my title. I've been here at Johnson Controls for about a year and a half now. But if I kind of go back to where it all started, I say I grew up at FedEx. I started with FedEx when I was in college as a part-time courier, went into management, senior management, managing director. I was over field, station managers, truck drivers, and then my last role was running the intersort within Indianapolis Hub. From there, I did a short stint in the internet. Was with a company called Webvan.
I've heard of that before.
Yes. I ran the central region out of Chicago for that area. Did a stint at a company called Brambles, where I was VP of service for there, and then a long career at GE. I led global parts and repair for GE Healthcare, the healthcare division. After that, did a stint in aerospace, a little bit of consulting, and then found myself here at JCI.
So you and I have two intersection points in a career, both at different one at the overlapping time and one at different times. So we joked about Webvan. I was at Webvan myself at the same time as you were, except I was in Foster City, California, the headquarters, and you were in the region in Chicago, and that was a big market for us. And I think you guys have done a phenomenal job getting that business brought to profitability pretty quickly. So that was one experience. And then you and I did not cross paths at General Electric. I think I preceded you by a few years at GE. So it's good to see those backgrounds.
Yeah.
Now, what I find interesting about your career is, you've been kind of theoretically in logistics related businesses or jobs, be it FedEx or Webvan, but then you've also been in and around manufacturing companies for the bulk of the career. Is there something that was an interesting overlap, or what was commonality, if you may, between those kinds of businesses that you were in, between the FedEx, Brambles, and then the GEs and the Johnson Controls of the world?
Yeah, the first half of my career was really in the logistics, but it was always on the customer side where, we were touching the customer. Whether it was in the B2B or B2C environment, it was always based on meeting those customer expectations. And then when I pivoted into more the manufacturing environment, still I was in the aftermarket space,
Right.
which is still, again, focused on the service element of it. So when you think of things, from how you drive customer experience, how you drive productivity with your field organization, how you create an internal organization that comes together and works with the speed, but always with the idea of the customer in mind. It's very different than if you're in a manufacturing plant. Ironically, the environment of FedEx and that field delivery and how you have that central organization that has to enable the field to be successful is quite similar to what we see in a field organization of service, where you're supporting an install base. You still have your field-based organizations. You're driving productivity. You're enabling those individuals to be as successful as possible. You're arming them with the tools and technology as well. So a lot of similarities.
It's interesting that your stops at FedEx, Webvan, and now at JCI as a global service business, there's quite a bit of technology involved in making sure you're connected to your end user and customer, as well as making sure that feedback comes back to you. Was there some specific things you took away in forms of technology, or was this just one of those things that you just automatically took for granted? Because FedEx, if I remember correctly, was always a pioneer in some of these investments in technology, right? Right from the early days. Is that a common thread across your career as well?
It definitely is, and it is in three elements. If we first think about the experience of our field organization, so whether it be a technician in my environment now or a courier in my environment way back then, the ability for that person to be as effective and efficient as possible is all based on the technology. If you think, way back in time, potentially before GPS, how could a delivery person be efficient? It always came down to how much volume in what short a space of time or small space of time could be as effective as possible. You fast forward to a field technician organization, if you're able to arm that technician with the information, the failure modes, the parts prior to their arrival, and potentially awareness of the failure modes that have been taking place, but also the history that's taken place, they can be more effective. So the first and foremost, the technology that allows our delivery or technician people to provide that experience. Secondarily, it's just the communications with our customers. Whether you're aware of the install base performance through technology or the expectations of the customer and the environment of which they work. So I would say, in all of the elements of the how something performs in the field, how our employees interface, and then, first and foremost, how our customers want to interface with us as an organization.
And I have one more question going back to your career history for me, right? So FedEx, Webvan, logistics related kind of mindset on service, and then you went into GE for about a dozen years, I think about a dozen years, plus or minus.
Yep.
But that was parts and service also, but that was from a manufacturing out versus purely a service and logistics. Was that how different was that for you in terms of adjustments? And, besides the logistics and customer service commonality, were there some things that are unique to that environment that kind of helped in a career progression as well?
Yeah, it's a great point. So if you think of the building block of a field organization and the customer experience, and you layer on top of that products that are being serviced in the field, and understanding failure modes, and understanding the performance of the products within the install base, and then the customer expectations, and those expectations will vary by vertical. So if you're in the healthcare space, or if you're in the aerospace space, or if you're in the building technology space, all of which will have very, very different overall expectations. If you have an aircraft on the ground or a patient on the table, the level of intensity, and also, speaking of technology, the level of technology that's required for you to be even more successful is important.
So one more question going back. Now, there's a set of choices you made along the career. I know you said you started off in FedEx while you were in college, working part-time, and you just naturally progressed. Did you go out seeking to be in logistics, or it just happened to be one of those things where, look, I'm in college, I need to pay for college, I'm going to get this job. FedEx happened to be a really good employer, and that's how we stumbled into this, or was there a desire around this?
That's exactly it. Frankly, they had a tuition reimbursement program.
Brilliant. It was always the best.
But what I found is that, it was just part of my DNA to be as efficient as possible. And you just love every aspect of that. It's whether you're trying to make as little trips as possible from the car to the kitchen with your groceries. If logistics and efficiency is in your DNA, this is kind of our happy place, if you will.
Yeah. There's something when I was in the services business myself a long time ago, not such a large field force as you have at JCI or certainly not at FedEx. But what I used to tell my product side people was that the services technicians and the people in the field are your closest connection to the end user and the customer. And they probably know more about what's happening in the customer than anybody at headquarters. The question I have for you is, how do you bring that knowledge back from the field, from the front lines, back to the people at the corporate headquarters or the divisional product areas or whatever it might be? Because I think that's a kind of a hidden gem or hidden treasure, if you may, right?
Yeah.
And that's a big part of
It's
it.
it's a great question. If you think about the life cycle curve, once a product is installed, it doesn't matter what product it is. It could be an MR or a CT, a chiller, or a aircraft that's in the field. But the life cycle of that customer will interface with that product is much broader than the transaction that takes place in terms of the installation. And throughout the life cycle, I always look at three things. One is as purchased. The second is as used. The third is as maintained. Those second two are quite different because if I purchase whatever that particular product is, and I am interfacing with that product in the Middle East versus interfacing with that product in New York City or interfacing with that product in Alaska, that as used and as maintained is going to be quite different. And so if I'm a manufacturing engineer and I'm designing a product and I'm kind of doing it within a box, but now I start to understand the as maintained and as used, that information being fed back into an engineering organization is quite useful because they then begin to understand how do I potentially push the parameters to be as effective and help their customers be as successful in their environment as possible.
So closing this feedback loop or ensuring that this knowledge is disseminated across all stakeholders in the value chain is really important. I've always said that aftermarket sales and service is really a team game, right? And kind of making the team play on the same field at the same time is really important. How do you make this happen? I mean, it's clearly a combination of people, process, and tools, but are there some things specifics that you do in terms of making sure that this team game functions as a team?
Yeah, if you kind of think about the people, process, and tools, if you will, first and foremost is from a people perspective is creating a structure and a environment in which that communication is constantly provided back and forth. And so whether it's in small group settings on a routine basis or part of a long range planning type of process where that information is dialed back in. And so that's done from a teamwork and a team of teams agile approach. Secondarily, is you have technology, and that will come in a couple of different areas. One is whatever CRM, whatever service system you use, you're going to have some methodology in which you're debriefing that experience and you're providing that feedback in an interval that allows that to feed back in. And then, of course, you have your warranty information. From there, partnering with marketing teams that can then go out and speak to customer resource groups. And then, of course, you're always going to have your business reviews with your top customers that provide that information. So in feedback from technicians, feedback from direct customer relationships, market type of customer back, that's the verbal, if you will, and then technology, whether it be warranty-based or CRM-based type of responses.
So this is quite a pretty significant coordination and making sure that the song sheet is the same for everybody is a big deal, right?
Yeah.
So then the notion of being able to apply some of those experiences you've had in terms of developing and implementing what I would call standard operating procedures, because you really want to have a consistency of experience no matter where you are. Of course, it's different in Abu Dhabi versus Bombay versus New York City, but the consistency of experience is important as you go through these jobs. And I think that I have to believe is probably something as part of your mandate, probably, right, as you go through this process.
Yeah, definitely. And there's going to be significant variation based on, as you said, geographical locations, but also the maturity of the product in the field in and of itself. If it's something that's early into the field, the expectation of performance may be a little bit lower than it's something that has maybe a long lifespan in the field, and it's just a later rendition where there's going to be very high expectations of performance. And because of that, the speed in which that feedback takes place is even more important.
Carla, you worked across, I think, in some ways, three, as in the old days, used to call academy institutions, right? Back FedEx was really like a world-class organization from the logistics point of view. GE, recent issues notwithstanding, was really one of the world-class exemplars in terms of discipline and operating execution and so on and so forth. And now JCI, obviously, we've had some great experiences in between too. But when you think of those companies, they all, to some degree, have been quote-unquote service champions, as I call them, right? Are there common themes in terms of mindset, culture, whatever it might be, that make these three companies stand out as what I call service or aftermarket champions, right? In the case of FedEx, it's clearly service, but
Yep.
GE and Johnson Controls.
So the one thing I always said, and this is obviously just my experience, but I always say I learned how to manage people at FedEx, and I learned how to manage business at GE, and the two
Nice.
came together at JCI. Um, at FedEx, the one thing, and again, this is back when I was there, is that you really learned how to manage an organization in a very, very efficient manner. It was all about efficiency. The employees were put first because by doing so, they delivered the customer experience, and then the profit came. But you really would focus on a very, very few things from a top level perspective. Obviously, a lot of leading indicators behind it, but of that simplified approach allowed that organization to move with such speed. Pivot into GE, which was a number of P&Ls. So you really had to understand both sides of the P&L. You really had to understand the trade-offs of investments here and the costs associated over there, and how you grow in a particular environment, especially within service. Um, and that kind of comes together at the with the JCI role.
The couple of things you talked about is the business of people at FedEx. That's common across everybody. The business of how to manage a business is now across everybody else. When you think of the context of, I have this framework I think about from aftermarket maturity, if you may, right? And it's a combination of people, process, and things. And I always tell people, look, most companies that I see that I've experienced in my manufacturing career are generally probably less sophisticated or less mature, if you may, in people, process, and technology combination. In the aftermarket, they tend to be reactive, mostly just making sure they keep stuff on hand as they need it, versus thinking proactively, prescriptively, and thinking about the future. In this progression, maturity progression, what kinds of things do you practice? What kind of things you do in terms of making sure that you're taking an organization at JCI, which is a pretty large global organization, into this notion of like high levels of maturity and prescriptive, predictive, forward-looking mindset? What are the things you guys practice, if you may, on all three aspects: people, process,
Yeah,
and tech?
in any service environment, the first thing to do is kind of understand where you are overall in the maturity curve. If you're in a reactive environment, you're waiting for the phone to ring, break fix. Usually you find that's an environment that is a service organization that's strictly an extension of a manufacturing. As you move up that maturity curve to where you're actually driving predictive and proactive, and just as we spoke before, and then you're building that back into the manufacturing, that's a high performing organizations, and there's steps along the way. And the organization will not move as a whole through those things. You'll end up, implementing different things, based on your appetite for investment,
Hmm.
based on your particular industry, based on the customer needs and expectations. So the first thing is, assessing where you are, but also assessing where you want to play within your industry, because that's also going to level set the investment and the period of time in which you'll actually get there.
What is there one thing when you think of these three legs of the stool? Is there one thing that you've seen more often than not as a failure mode, when things don't go well, when things don't go as they should, or is it context dependent?
I think in many large companies, you'll usually find that companies are a number of acquisitions over time. And because of that, there's going to be a level of complexity that they interface with. You're going to have multiple systems and multiple different processes. And so the way that organization has historically grown is through those acquisitions. So there has to be that appetite of trying to create a level of stability and a level of predictability, but still allowing for that agility for the
Mhm.
growth. It's because there will continuously be, more acquisitions,
Mhm.
more expansions. It's not like it's a box that you're just moving forward from stage to stage.
I'm actually surprised, not surprised, but actually it's good to hear that point of view, because my experience in the last 10, 15 years has been that, or even longer, has been the fact that weirdly enough, and I think you mentioned this in your FedEx point, right? I've seen people, be it skill, will, competency, if you may, as the weakest link quite often. Not necessarily weakest link, but is the big issue, because it's hard to change an organization to kind of get the right people in place and then investing in process and technology. But at least that's one of my experiences. And so I'm glad to see that you've seen some other aspects of the maturity success or not success as maybe. Carla, when I think of your career, were you an engineer, by the way, by training, or were you
No,
just
actually not.
so you came at this from a completely different perspective. Now you're running really a very large global technical services organization, right? Complicated workflows, complicated products. How do you kind of transition or translate those non-technical training that you had all, and even FedEx, yes, it's technical, but not really, to something as complex as what you're doing today?
The one thing about service is that it's a bit of general management. So I have a passion for engineering, yet I'm not an engineer. I have a passion for finances, but if I just spent my time looking at spreadsheets, I go crazy. I love spending time with teams and with people and meeting customer needs. So it's one of those things where I kind of wear a lot of hats, and I enjoy each hat that I put on. As I mentioned, I'm not an engineer, but I'm a pilot. I love to travel, but I don't speak multiple languages. I mean, so there's a little bit of bits and pieces in
Yeah,
a lot of areas that are part of me.
yeah,
But I find what makes someone most successful in a leadership role is how you empower and build teams. So it's always not so much how smart am I, but how smart am I to get other people smarter than me around me to be successful. I'll have the smartest engineers on my team, the most passionate customer service people on my team, the best finance people available on my team, all of which I can't hold a candle to. But together, as an organization, we'll be very successful.
I think you massively undersold an aspect of your career that I think is really valuable. So, FedEx, Webvan, GE, Aerospace, Brambles, JCI, very different industries, very different product types, very different setups of the organization. But the common theme, and you said this in your thing, you learn managing people and leading people at FedEx. By the way, my first job at a business school was running a factory at Johnson & Johnson. I tell people that was the best job I had because I had a bunch of high school educated people at best, 100 people, and he was this young grad out of business school trying to manage this. And that is the hardest management or leadership job I had, but the best and set me up. And I think I look at your career as spanning all these different functions, all these different industries. And I think that's a common thread for you, I think, in some ways. And again, I think you're underselling your the leadership skills when you say that. Now, one of the points of the show is that kind of translating some of these experiences as advice, if you may, for people who want to be like you, people who want to become a senior leader and aftermarket and service like you. Are there a couple of points of advice that you think that is relevant to them?
Yeah, one thing is you definitely have to feel comfortable with um, being the second or third person. So whether you're going to be in a FedEx environment or a manufacturing environment, your position really is to make everybody else successful. As a service leader, first and foremost, your job is to knock down barriers and to make your frontline employees as successful as possible in the eyes of the customer. Surround yourself with very, very smart people. Understand your weaknesses and bring in a lot of talent that can compensate for those. And really spend your time understanding the needs of the team and the needs of the customer, and then build that infrastructure and roadmap around that.
I think those are the kinds of things that are fundamental building blocks of leadership that a lot of people don't get these days. And I think those are the kind of experiences, formative experiences you had, starting with FedEx to get to this point. Carl, I like to end these discussions with a very simple thing, right? I'm a big fan of podcasts, obviously, which is why I'm doing one. I love this Guy Raz podcast when he talks and how I built this, or view from the top, right? All those things. And he has this fabulous question at the end, right? He always asks people like, when you look at this arc of the career, how much do you ascribe to luck versus how much you ascribe to your own sense of capability and functionality, function, if you may, to get to this point, right? I love this question because it's something that just always sticks in my mind.
Interesting, interesting. Luck. You know what? I think I would probably, the word luck, I would probably substitute for network, because every single role that I have taken in some way, shape, or form, somebody has led me to it. Um, it's creating that infrastructure and that support of a lot of people that make you very valuable. and where people always want you as part of their team. So I would say, as I said, I wouldn't say luck, I would say network. In addition to that, I wouldn't necessarily say skill sets as much as being able to build the team around me so we as a team are very successful. It's like if you're putting together an orchestra, you want the best first chairs of all that's available to you. And then you have your succession plan with those second chairs and then sometimes third. And you really are looking for that orchestra to play beautifully together, not necessarily very well individually. And so it's that ability to build the team. So I wish I could say it was because I was so smart, but I think it's really more so that I've been able to surround myself with a lot of really good talent. And as that talent has expanded and moved on, that's created my network for me.
That's awesome. One last question, because this is something I've never been able to do. I've always wanted to be a pilot and never have achieved that. At this point, I think I'm done. What do you like to fly? What plane do you like to fly?
So I have what's called a DA-42, which is a Diamond twin engine. I've been flying for over 20 years, and
Wow.
you start out in a Cessna,
Yeah.
and then it's just like a boat. You always want something bigger and faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for me, flying is really about freedom and about the challenge of planning that perfect route. So it's not really getting to the destination; it's the process of getting there and the planning and how everything comes together and the things you experience along the way.
That's exciting. I wish I could have taken up flying 20 years ago myself, but so be it.
Hey,
I will
it's
just
never
fly
too
as a
late.
passenger. I'll never fly. Yeah. Well, excellent. Well, Carl, this has been fascinating. I think it is a very, very concise way to kind of encapsulate a career. It really starts with people. It's about surrounding, not just being able to be with the right people, but get trained up with the people, building the team around you to ensure success, putting the scaffolding of people and process and technology around it to kind of drive this global organization. Look, I know you're a busy person, global organization, morning calls to Europe, evening calls to Asia. So I'm going to give you some of your time back in the calendar. I really, really appreciate you taking time today. This has been a very valuable conversation today. I appreciate it for taking the time, and thanks for all the work you do for us as well. Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Carla.
much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the time we spent together.
I appreciate it. Thank you.